Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of The New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analysts podcast, a show about application, development, and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. Apcera is the sponsor for this episode of the New Stack Analysts. Apcera is one of these companies that is really focusing on providing the trust and security that companies really need when they're thinking about delivering their workloads in today's dynamic cloud environment. We're living in a world of distributed infrastructure with a real need for a policy-first approach, something that Apcera really focuses on. Apcera delivers that increase in agility, that security, and that speed across any IT infrastructure that companies really need. You can learn more about Apcera at apcera.com. That's apcera.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here for another episode of the New Stack Analysts. Today I am joined by my colleague at the New Stack, Lee Calcote. Hey, Lee, how are you?
Hey, Alex. Thanks for having me on.
And we're lucky to have two people from the Apcera team who are the sponsor for this podcast. We'd like to thank very much for their participation. We have Josh Ellithorpe. Hey, Josh.
Hello. How you doing, Alex?
Good. And Jaime Piña. Hey, Jaime, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having us on.
Great. And I think one of the most interesting ways that we can ever do these podcasts is to have people tell their own stories. You know, the company's perspective on how they're using a technology. What we're trying to do is hear personal stories about how people have participated in open source ecosystems over the years. And I thought this might be an excellent opportunity to hear from you guys about that. So Josh and Jaime, we'd love to hear your stories. And Lee, you know, I'm sure you have your own stories too. So we'd like to use that kind of as a way, as a narrative to help discuss open source communities and how they've evolved and where they are today and kind of some of the trends that we're seeing. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Great. So Josh, tell us about your start in open source and how it's evolved.
Oh, absolutely. So I started getting into open source at a really early age. So I remember diving into open source tools in about 1994, 95 timeframe. And back then I was just, a script kiddie trying to learn. And I would investigate products and look at the code that was available. And obviously the space was way different back then, where there was a lot less open source. But because I didn't have access to large-scale commercial code bases, I was 14 years old, I didn't have access to the tools, and I wanted to learn new languages. And there was only two avenues available to me at the time. One was printed literature. I know that sounds crazy, but books, because I didn't have internet at that time. There was no internet rollout back in 94. And this was source code that was being traded around on bulletin boards and BBS systems. And they were like gold. It was ways for me to learn, ways for me to kind of see how these different products were built. And that's obviously evolved over the years, but it really had a huge lasting impact on me as a developer.
How did you get involved in the first place in application, in like coding and programming?
So I got my first computer when I was 6, and I started programming using DOS and BASIC way back in the day with trivial little, print go-to type style applications.
How did you get involved in it at the age of 6?
So I just knew that I liked computers. I was an avid gamer when I was a little kid. I had like an Atari and stuff. And I kept telling
how old were you when you were gaming then?
Oh, well, I started gaming on my Atari when I was 2. So that
Wait a second. Okay, let's back up here to 2. So when you were 2 years old, What were your parents recognizing in you at that age?
So my mom wasn't around a lot. She worked at the ad agencies, and I was at home a lot during the day by myself and with my ama at the time in Hong Kong. And Atari had become a really big thing. And so she just thought it'd be cool to get me a 2600. And at first she thought I was just mashing buttons. I was a little tiny kid. But then she realized that I was actually, getting better at the games I was playing, and she realized I actually understood what was going on there. And when I was 6, my grandmother was nice enough to get me my Tandy 1000EX, no hard drive, side-loading floppy disk. And I remember playing Lode Runner and King's Quest and those types of titles back then. So I just started playing around with this stuff then. But I didn't really get serious about programming until I was about 12 years old. And then when I was 12, I was writing a lot more code. And that was just because I found it mentally interesting.
I heard some reminiscing here.
Yeah, you're taking me back. Yeah, solidarity, man. It's a Tandy 1000. The whole 640K of, I guess it was RAM is the...
Yeah, I mean, those machines were ancient. And I remember when I got my first real computer, I got my Mac 2 CI. And that machine, I was so happy to get. Took a lot of, nagging my parents to get it. But when I got that, I started doing a lot of scripting. I was using just scripting toolkits like Keyquincer, OneClick, and learned, basic logic gates and things like that through scripting languages. And then that kind of proceeded further. I learned TCL, which is, again, showing my age. And I started writing a lot of TCL and writing network code and actually bots in TCL. Wow. And that led to me a lot of curiosity in how networks worked, how packets were sent. What is this thing, TCP/IP? What is it? How is this all working? And a lot of the BBS software I'd used for dial-up days started transitioning to working over the internet. Tools like First Class Client, Telefinder, etc. And that just kept me learning.
That's interesting. Tickle is still prominent. I mean, not within SDN land, but just still prominent within Cisco's products lines today.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, I've written, hundreds of thousands of lines of Tickle. And if you look online and you're very, thorough in your search, you can find some early tools I wrote, but I'm not going to divulge those as part of this podcast.
Dang it. I'll have to look for those.
So open source tooling sounds like it's just been there from day one for you.
Yes, and it's probably my predominant way of learning new technology. And that's how I learned C. It's how I learned Objective-C. It's how I learned Perl, PHP, Ruby. Most of the languages that I'm familiar with today were because of the open source community, with the exception of Go, which I learned here on the job, but then leveraged the open source community to improve my knowledge after I had started using it in the corporate setting.
Jaime, how about yourself? Tell us your story.
Sure. So mine is a little different, actually. My first computer was actually not that old. It was a Windows 98 Pentium 2 processor. It was the first computer my parents bought me. I must have been in middle school when I got my first computer. So not as old as the ones you guys were talking about, but just as cool. And I don't know, I didn't really know how the computer worked. I knew it was cool and I knew it could do cool things. And I was always really curious about how things worked. And I just, when I was going through high school, I had a somewhat of a programming course at my high school. It wasn't actually a programming course. It was kind of, but it wasn't, because all the course was, all we had to do was copy BASIC. So that was the first language I learned, was actually BASIC, QBasic for Windows. And we just had to copy that and write it, type it all into a computer. And so it was fun, but I was still curious about, how can I make the computer do, exactly what I want. And I'd been picking at that for a couple of years. I actually started programming for the first time when I was in college. And I was at San Jose State, and I picked up Java first. That was the first. Unfortunately, that was the first. That was the first language that I learned. But then, I kept learning little by little, and it was awesome that all of a sudden I had this. I don't know. I think about it as this like superpower where I could make the computer do basically whatever I wanted, and so that kind of just fueled me to keep learning. A little later, I transferred to another university, and I started collaborating more with people there. We had this awesome environment at that university where we would all get together in a computer lab, and we would collaborate doing the homework. And sometimes one person would figure out the answer really quickly, and other times, that person would help out other people, and we'd all just kind of share like the algorithms and the ideas, and we taught each other. How to do quicksort, not just copy, right? Because if you just copy code, you don't learn anything. But really, it was shared collaborating, and I think open source in general is a way for people to teach other people how to do things, and I think it's immensely useful that way. So I started. I'd say I really started with open source in college when I started collaborating with fellow students and the projects.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Lee, were you 6 months old when you started coding?
I was in pull-ups at the time. I was definitely pre-races. We did have an Atari. We did have the Tandy 1000. Thinking back on it now, I cannot believe my father let me do the things that I did to that Tandy 1000. It was, instead of a first car for me, and I grew up in part up in South Dakota, so you could start driving when you were 14, and lots of kids save up to get cars. I saved up and got a Pentium 90. So beat that one high me up.
So I'm in the same boat. I turned down my first car to get a Power Tower 180. And that machine cost over $4,000. And that was a huge milestone.
We're not talking muscle cars. We're talking muscle PCs here.
Yeah, exactly.
That's actually the kicker is that, I bet once you got that $4,000 piece of equipment home, and I know it was the same for me. I cracked it open and went to, of course, upgrade to the Sound Blaster sound card. And I think I gave my parents a heart attack when I cracked open the case for something that expensive. But that's just to Jaime's point, like, hey, that's the way that you learn.
Absolutely.
Do you guys find that the open source communities that you're in now there are a lot of people who kind of have similar backgrounds?
So I think that the similarity is that when you are younger, you don't have access to commercial software. You have access to run it, but you'd have no idea how it works. And there's no nice way to really disassemble that software without a large level of expertise. And therefore, your only mechanism is, school, books, and looking at other projects that people, through the kindness of their heart, let you look at the code for. And when that's your only option, you start using that, and it becomes a linchpin of your career moving forward. And I think that developers today really share that experience. And that's really what has pushed open source as you want to give back to the community that taught you. And it's constantly this recycle of your mentality. It's like, okay, I've pulled these things from the open source community. I've leveraged them to good effect. What can I give back to these people? Do they need fixes for their libraries? Is there another tool they need that maybe I could write? And that conversation becomes pervasive in your mind.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, like you were saying, or you're asking if a lot of developers have similar backgrounds. I think, a lot of developers do share that kind of point of view, where it's like, hey, I've learned so much from, GitHub, from Stack Overflow. It doesn't even have to be code, right? And all these other places that the community has brought up, and you kind of feel gratitude, and you have a feeling of altruism, and it's nice to give back to the community. It gives you like warm, fuzzy feelings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
a bit of karma in there too.
So when you engage in that way and you start to learn to kind of collaborate, then what are the environments that you have found have worked well for you, when you were just getting started inside open source communities?
So I guess I'll take the plunge first. Honestly, it's only one thing that comes to mind for me is IRC. IRC was my biggest motivator. Back in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, IRC was the place that developers went. They talked about their projects, they did that. That's changed a lot today, where you see tools like Slack really invading on the IRC space. And a lot of the IRC chat rooms that were so bubbling with activity now really are people idling in a chat room. And the community has changed a lot. But early on, I couldn't have learned as much as I did if it wasn't for that online community of chat users.
So it's interesting because we think of GitHub as like a collaborative platform as well, right? And but is it really that much different as an environment for collaborating, or is it more just the shared nature of the network that distinguishes it? I guess that's part of the question I have. I guess the other part of the question I have is about what you're saying about IRC. It's like, if the IRC community has been deflated in some respects, has it inflated into places, into GitHub? Is that where the interaction you're seeing is now? I think, or is it through Twitter, or is it so highly distributed that it's really no place at all?
I think it's definitely GitHub. GitHub changed the way developers work more than any other site that I can remember. And, a lot of that happens on GitHub and more web-based chat tools today like Slack. And it really replaced these independent protocols we used to use. Mm-hmm. You look at the world online today, and most of it is encapsulated over HTTP today. Most of it has been replaced by web tools, whether that's old tools like Usenet being replaced by more forum approaches in the web space, or online chat tools. Git in particular, and GitHub's leveraging of the amazing technology that is Git, has really brought on a new era where people can collaborate and work on projects together with amazing tooling. I remember using CVS. I remember sending around diffs. I remember Perforce and SVN and all these other tools that existed. But until the real distributed version control started to hit, things like Mercurial and Git, it was still very segmented. And Git just changed the way people work day to day.
Yeah, definitely centralize that. I'm thinking for the community that helped me the best is actually friends. Maybe I'm too young for IRC, but I found that talking with friends, having friends that knew things that I didn't know, and vice versa, sometimes I would know things that they didn't know, and just being able to share my screen, like turn my screen in and show like, hey, I got this code working, check it out. Or being able to, on a whiteboard or a chalkboard, draw out some algorithms or something. I think that definitely helped me. And I think maybe that's why some of these newer like HTTP tools like Slack or Gitter on GitHub have really helped, because it just makes collaboration so much easier.
The learning curve is a lot shorter, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Right. If I can just copy and paste a little snippet of code instead of running diff tools and sending people a diff, and maybe they don't know how to reassemble the diff or anything like that, that's just a barrier to collaboration. So I think that's why the web-based stuff has really made it a lot easier to collaborate now.
And a lot easier to track, So when you do mess up, what commits were bad. You learn your lessons faster, and it really helps out the process.
And not just learning your lessons, but you can also remember the lessons. So it's not enough, you might learn something one day, 1 month, but then, when you go back and look at your code a year later, you might forget, like, why did I do that? Or how did this change? And especially tools like Git really help you kind of go back in time and figure out, oh, this is why I did that.
Yeah. I still remember when I learned Git, and I was lucky enough, I was working at Oakley at the time, and Scott Chacon came to train us on Git to move us off of SVN. And it was really a pleasure to work with him and the amazing work he's done to the Git community as well.
Well, now, Jaime, to the extent that those friends were really a facilitator for you.
Yeah.
And I guess for Josh as well, do meetups kind of, facilitate that, here and now?
So I go to meetups actually fairly frequently, and they're good for certain things. I think having friends is more beneficial because it's more of a one-on-one, whereas if you do a meetup, it's kind of like a big classroom setting, and at least for me, the classroom setting has not always been the most effective tool. It's always nice when you have someone one-on-one where you can ask all the dumb questions that you can think of, right? And asking those questions is really important because you get those doubts out of your head, and then you solidify what you think you might know, and you really nail it down. Meetups are really good for meeting people and building a network. Sometimes they're good for learning new things, but I think you really have to, after the meetup, you have to go and like look the stuff up and maybe do a tutorial on what they were talking about. And so the meetup is just for like picking out some information, but I don't think it's too much for like learning something.
I'm in full agreement with Jaime there. Meetups for me, I don't learn at a meetup. I get ideas at a meetup.
Yeah.
I need to write the code and I need to actually use the tools that they've discussed before I feel like I'm actually learning.
So I'm curious, so we're seeing a lot more people able to just use the internet, for example, just to learn the code, right? Mm-hmm. You can go to meetups and, get new ideas, right? But how do open source ecosystems scale? It seems to me that, what you're seeing a lot these days in open source ecosystems, at least in some respects, are, because the open source ecosystems are becoming more commercialized, right? There's more corporate involvement inside, open source ecosystems, which is I'm not saying that's good or bad, but there's definitely ecosystems out there that have, one company might have a strong role in it. They may not participate in other communities that don't, that aren't within aligning with their interests. And how do you scale communities like that? I know you guys, at Apcera have open source communities that you participate in. How do you scale in these kind of environments?
So to me, it's really kind of hit and miss, at least in my experience. Tools that I thought would be gangbusters for the open source community, and I've watched them collect dust. I've written what I considered toys and then watched them explode in the open source community. And I really think that people want to feel valued, and they want to feel like their contributions are heard more than anything. So it's about being able to support the people that are sending you pull requests and working with them through the issues that they have through those PRs, and establishing the personal relationships with those developers over time so that they feel like they're involved in the project. And if you don't have that feeling of home for your project, then those developers are going to drop off and you're going to lose the traction that you need. And so you really need both. You need an amazing idea, and you need to make sure that you build the relationships with people that want to help you facilitate that idea.
How about the tools then, and the platforms themselves? Are they designed to scale? Are they designed to have the capability to to keep up with the code, with the approvals and such that you definitely need? When does it become the organization of the open source community that has to supersede the capabilities and the tools and the platforms themselves?
So I think that a lot of the automation tools we see today are really to facilitate faster, like quick involvement for those developers. So things like automatic code checks, CI/CD checks on your repositories, validating things, tools like Travis, and really become the cost of doing business for your open source community. You need to make sure that there's tools out there to help the developer and facilitate them to iterate quickly and be able to iterate safely on your project without affecting your other users.
Gosh.
I think that that's critical to the success. So those automation tools are things that people have integrated really nicely into GitHub now. Jaime brought up Gitter earlier as a chat solution for GitHub. We have solutions like Travis, which are now breaking out into the enterprise space after establishing good mental, a good model for the community in the open source space. So I see a lot of people building tools, vetting those in open source areas, and then eventually maturing those to the point that enterprise software and commercial software vendors are looking to leverage those tools after using them for so long within the open source space.
Alex had a fantastic question. I'm going to expand on that just because that notion of scale, not only do you start to question, are the tools ready and can they handle it? But also processes. And I don't know if the word bureaucracy is the right one, but just how do you, to the extent that you go from 12 people to 1,200 people, how do you know who are the core maintainers? I won't even go through the list of all of the processes and practices you need to have in place. That's certainly sometimes where projects grow so big that they look for some of that help from various open source foundations. To what extent do you feel like foundations have a place? Have you taken projects to foundations? Or just do you feel like you guys have been successful in scaling outside of third-party governance, so to speak?
To be honest, whether or not I contribute to a open source repository has very little to do with whether or not there's a foundation there. In fact, I find that when you have too many heads that are trying to lead a project, that inevitably the development of that project actually slows. And I think that I get pleasantly surprised on my projects on a regular basis with things I didn't predict I wanted or needed, but once I saw them, I realized the immediate value there. So I don't like it when communities put too many rules and regulations around what can be submitted. And I think that as the project grows, it is really, I like to look at it as a democratic process where based on the merit of the PR and the number of users of that software that want to leverage that feature, that's really the conversation that needs to take place. And I found that when foundations get involved, there's a little bit too much dictation about the direction of the project, and that actually stifles innovation.
That makes sense. How about a benevolent dictator? Is that, or is there, or maybe just outside of foundations and their governance, in a model where a project doesn't have that? How, have you found any best practices in and around setting those policies where, there's a certain number of core approvers that need to happen versus, or is it just like you said, totally democratic and it's just all about the votes? So
I could use an example that I was looking at GitHub yesterday. So there's a giant conversation right now about whether or not the Go programming language should implement certain type alias functionality. And there was a proposal posted on GitHub, and there's probably 150 plus comments from very qualified developers that are both on the Go core team and people from the outside that have been leveraging the language for a long period of time. And I think that those conversations absolutely need to happen. There's core maintainers for Go that disagree on whether or not that feature should merge. So who ends up being the tiebreaker there? Does the community want it? Is there good motivations for those features to be added? And I think that those conversations and the proposal process for those larger projects is extremely important, even if you get back to the conclusion that you don't want that feature. You've known that it's been discussed, and now you have a wonderful paper trail about the conversation that ensued and whether or not it had merit to be added. And I think that is the spirit of open source software.
Let's take a quick break and get back to the show. Apcera is the sponsor for this episode of the new Stack Analysts. Apcera is one of these companies that is really focusing on providing the trust and security that companies really need when they're thinking about delivering their workloads in today's dynamic cloud environment. We're living in a world of distributed infrastructure with a real need for a policy-first approach, something that Apcera really focuses on. Apcera delivers that increase in agility, that security, and that speed across any IT infrastructure that companies really need. You can learn more about Apcera at apcera.com. That's APCERA.com. Now let's get back to the show.
Speaking of those comments and just that flood of feedback, a lot of times that ends up being just this very long, multi-threaded, GitHub issue page that can be really difficult to come up to speed on. Do you have you found many people requesting, post-mortem write-ups to just lay that question to rest for good, or do people
I haven't really seen that. Usually the conversation ensues and, people kind of vote on what they think is needed. Mm-hmm. Every now and again on a project, it will, the original designer of that project will make a unilateral decision based on what he wants to do as one of the core maintainers. But I think that even if someone is going to decide to do that, getting all the facts on the table onto the use cases and whether or not these features have merit is a huge value proposition, even if those features don't end up being merged, because you've qualified why they didn't merge. Why wasn't this something we wanted in the language? And then people can choose based on those decisions whether or not they want to support those communities moving forward. Is that community going in the same direction that I want it to go in? Perhaps, and right now we don't have any shortage of options in the space. Very seldom is there just one tool that does something. And people can choose based on the direction of those tools which ones they want to mature faster. And then those tools will mature based on the developer response and the amount of time and effort that have gone into them. And it helps everybody.
Yeah, you were speaking about, the process and whether people do postmortems. I've actually seen that. The Go team I know actually has released a couple of documents. So they write up some stuff on Google Docs, and they take feedback from the community. And for example, they did this with the vendoring spec, and they've done this with a couple of other big features I've noticed as well. So I think, speaking to the process, I think that's a good idea. I think that would, if it's such a big conversation, such a big multi-threaded conversation, then I think it would be a good idea to break that out into a document and kind of collect the facts a little bit more cleanly. So maybe another thing that would help the process is, this is something that I noticed, writing good bug reports. When people submit bug reports to some of my projects, at least I've noticed that a lot of times it's just kind of like, hey, this doesn't work. But I think that would be another maybe slightly bureaucratic decision that might help an open source project, is like sitting down, hey, write what version of Go you're using, what version of your OS, and all these other details.
Well, bring out the soapbox. I mean, don't be shy. Let's
yeah, right. Because you want to help this person. You want to help the guy on the other side of this screen. You want to make his job as easy as possible, because he's going to merge something that you wrote that you want. So making it as easy as possible for that person, I think, is important. Being nice, I think, would also get you a little bit further, as opposed to being, maybe a little bit ranty or angry.
Absolutely. Politeness and respect for these people that are investing time in your project is critical. And they need to understand that if they've spent time and effort building something for you and the community, that if you don't want to merge that, then they need to understand the why. And generally, I want to help them get it to the state where it is something that can be merged, so that they can feel proud that they've contributed to the community and have benefited your project. But sometimes there's PRs you look at and they're just bad. And you have to be able to rectify that as well.
Yeah, I'm curious about when the open source community does scale, or the project does scale. how do you avoid the pitfalls of any organization from having practices go into effect that will inevitably slow it anyway? And I guess I'm curious, how you accomplish that. I guess, one of the things is like, this is what to me is so fascinating is kind of this continual tool development, right? To automate the process as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Josh brought that point up earlier. At least for my personal projects, I do have a lot of automation tools set up in place to even before someone submits a PR, I have some static analysis tools that will catch bugs. Some of the projects I have are in Go, and so I use things like GoVed, GoLint, GoFumped, and there are other tools that catch even different types of bugs, and having those tools in place, I think would definitely help you scale and make the development faster because things are caught even before anyone submits a PR.
Exactly. So there's two classifications of issues that could happen from the PR phase. There's, the logic that they're trying to do is not right. I can't fix that. But sometimes it's just the style of the code that they've written is not adhering to the best practices of the language that they're using. They may have come from another language, and the logic that they're trying to do may be fine. So a little bit of hand-holding to help them know what the best practices are, and having the automated tools to be able to let them know that up front when they're putting up their PRs is critical. And then you have sites like Go Report Card, et cetera, that aggregate these linting tools and make it easy for developers to run them against your projects. These provide tremendous value.
The tools themselves might even facilitate or might even help maintainers keep a consistent line between being pedantically idiomatic in terms of like either the style of language that's being used or just conventions used within the project, and allowing the tool to kind of be the first take that first blush.
What I found is that when a tool reports something to one of my committers, it is never viewed as rude.
Yes.
If I'm looking at a PR and I knit every other line based on the conventions of the language, I'm the one that looks like I'm being the mean bad guy.
Yeah,
so
let the robot do it.
Guy, because he's not a bad guy. He's just trying to make sure the code quality stays high.
Yes, exactly.
And that is a huge benefit, because then people don't look at you and say, oh man, this guy just says all this bad stuff about my PRs and I don't want to commit to this project. That conversation kind of gets pushed to the side as all that conversation has been automated away.
Yeah. Exactly what I was going to say. Back when I was in college, actually, my friend and I would get into arguments because I used to put the curly brace on the left and he used to put it on the right. So we had the great curly brace wars, and that's just kind of silly. So that just took time away from actual development. And so these automation tools, it's important to have them because they just save you time. They save people's feelings.
See, the most loved and hated feature in Go is Go format. Some people don't agree with the format that Go format does. But everybody agrees that a tool like that standardizes what that format should be is something that has tremendous use for the projects. And I hope that more languages write tools like Go format and make it more standardized as to the correct syntax style that is consistent. Even if I don't like every choice they make, when I'm looking at other code, it makes it easier for me to read. And that is a huge benefit as well.
It's interesting, the human element and how frustrating it can be, and how, and developers, like any human, have their own individual tastes and styles and preferences. I don't know if you guys watch Silicon Valley.
Yes.
But remember there was that episode this last season with Richard and it was like, the space bar. Don't go there. You don't want to go there.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard made a bad decision on that one, but that's okay. Because,
No, and the hilarious part is that is definitely true. I mean, I've seen people get into really
there's like,
really stuff like
So that leads me to questions is like, as communities grow, what are the tools to manage the individuals in the organization? And that seems to be kind of a weak area that, an area that still needs, a lot of help. I mean, and the most complex one of them all, because now we're just dealing with semantics,
Well, it's the sophistication of the product that you're doing. So if you're writing a small library or you're writing a small application, the automation tooling is actually really easy, as a lot of that's been really well integrated into GitHub. But the moment that you're talking about some of the newer, larger projects, you look at a Kubernetes, or you look at something that is millions of lines of code that requires more than basic unit tests, that's where those automation tools are starting to fall a little short. I need to spin up a Kubernetes cluster on AWS and actually run tests against a live cluster. That's not just testing code. That's automating deployments of large-scale platforms. This work is hard. This is stuff that takes time and effort, and it doesn't come for free. But for the smaller projects, I would argue that the tooling is amazing, and that for those projects, everything you need is not only free, but easy to integrate. And you have lots of examples online, whether that's you wanting to leverage Travis or chatting tools or other code tools on GitHub.
But managing the people, though, managing like the people inside the organization, is
slightly different. I agree with you on that, actually. And I actually kind of think there should be a little bit more on the tooling for humans, not just the programs. So one of the things I've noticed after working on GitHub for a while and collaborating with other people on projects is that GitHub, they recently released like a pull request template, right? Where you can put instructions when a human goes and submits a pull request, and you can say like, make sure you run tests, make sure if you remove something, you are conscious about breaking backwards compatibility or things like that. Ultimately, that's an honor system. And we humans we make mistakes. And even if you read that, and even if you do run some of the tests, you're going to miss things just because that's the nature of the work. So I wish there were maybe some enforcement features in GitHub or in some of these platforms. I know GitLabs, for example, you can actually set the number of LGTMs that are required to merge a PR, and having a mechanical or having a mechanism there that would physically hide or disable the merge button unless certain conditions are met, I think would help the people aspect. Because people forget to run tests, or people forget to think about these corner cases, and so GitHub's just honor system kind of way of doing things. I don't think is always the best. So we need tools I guess something like static analyzers or some sort of tools that prevent people from forgetting things or making mistakes.
So for some of my larger repos, I kind of do that through facilitating robust tests for my projects, and really leaning on the test harnesses to make sure that the quality and compatibility is maintained. So if someone's going to put up a PR and it changes functionality, I'm going to expect that they put in tests to validate what they did works, and make sure that the tests for all the other functionality that was expected continues to work on that PR. Then it just becomes a style, or does that feature belong in this repository, rather than is there a risk of breakage?
How do you guarantee that the maintainers are treating everybody equally, right? There may be a subset of the community who doesn't have the seniority, for instance, perhaps in that organization as other people might, right? Or they may be very new to the community, or they then don't fit the profile perhaps of the individuals who are part of that community.
This is true, and I think that those are really difficult to avoid, and that is what leads to software forks on a regular basis. Yeah. If you look at the community today, you have open source tools that do similar things, but they have different ways of accomplishing that thing. We have multiple different object stores and other things where they're more complicated products, but people have taken different approaches to them. You have major pieces of software that end up being forked because they disagree philosophically with the way the current system is operating. But that is the beauty of open source as well. Change is okay.
That it can fork. Yeah. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to make sure that we cover anything else that you guys want to talk about. But Lee, I just want to turn it over to you if there's any last question you have.
I've got a couple of burning things that, Jaime, I think I'll borrow that soapbox from you for a minute if I can.
Sure.
And it's just a couple of things that kind of, one has frustrated me, I think, as I've seen, engineers move from organization to organization or company to company, that, as compared to closed source software, they've got a really hard time sort of representing themselves and their accolades because they are behind the firewall. And I guess, I don't know that I've got a question here as much as I just wanted to kind of get this off my chest and sort of soapbox.
Sure.
How nice it is for them to be able to carry, to have done those things and carry them with them as they go. And I know you guys are living and breathing that. And as you do that, let me just maybe ask you this question. If you had to keep only one versus the next, would it be your LinkedIn profile or your GitHub profile?
GitHub profile.
You'll pry that GitHub profile out of my cold, dead hands.
Okay. Well, then the other question I had was, this is more of just, a trend that I've been noticing here recently, and it's in and around not just large companies, but companies that have been historically closed source. They've been purposefully going out and seeking seasoned open source leaders to come in and put conscious thought and strategy around an open source perspective and how that company begins to embrace and begins to move certain projects or create new projects in open source. Have you guys either been in organizations that have made that, gone across that journey, or have you just been fortunate enough to?
Well, I'll be honest, Apcera is part of that journey. So we are a closed source vendor. We ship commercial software and we provide binaries to our customers. And that leads to, you look at projects like Docker, et cetera, that have a huge open source community and they have a great use case. And we feel like we have a great use case here, and we started working on that far before Docker existed, but we decided to do that for an enterprise-based model with closed source. And that wasn't my decision here. But when I joined, we realized that we want to be able to give back to the community. So what's the best way to facilitate giving something back when you are maintaining a commercial product? And I think the litmus test becomes, well, is there general purpose tools that are not your revenue generator that you needed to build that other people would find useful? And I think that if you use that litmus test, then you can find lots of things within a commercial vendor environment that can be a candidate for open source. And that's led to open source projects from us, like NATS, our messaging system. We have our open source project Libretto, which is a Golang VM provisioning library. And we built that because we needed a general purpose library to provision VMs in Go. We didn't want to leverage a third-party tool like a Vagrant or Terraform. We wanted simple hooks, something like Fog, but it didn't exist for Go. And when we knew that we needed to build it for ourselves, we saw that as an optimal opportunity for us to be able to release something to the community that would provide them good value. In addition, our container runtime, Kerma, was open sourced, and we have done a lot in the container space. And we wanted to be able to show someone our expertise in that field. But just the container runtime is not our enterprise solution. We want to provide an end-to-end PaaS and infrastructure orchestration solution that is first class for that entire use case. So the container runtime itself isn't what we're selling. So why don't we give some of that expertise back? And then on my personal projects, I released a QoS system in 2001 called Throttled. And I wanted to release the intellectual property around how I did the QoS system and what building blocks in the OS I used and released that as open source because I wanted other developers to be able to learn and understand how that technology worked. But then I built a shareware offering on top of that added a graphical user interface, and I charged for that. But that wasn't any special sauce. That wasn't any special code that other people couldn't develop. And I felt like I'd given all of the mentally interesting pieces of that project away for people to learn while still finding a way to be able to monetize that and pay back for the time that I spent developing that product. And it ended up working very, very well.
I see that. Well, let me play devil's advocate with another question here. And just, of the various projects, maybe outside of the one that you just mentioned, because you found a path there for monetization, but of the other open source projects, how has it benefited either Apcera or other by open sourcing? I mean, just as you reflect on the choice to take some of those non-core or those non-monetized efforts and do them in an open way, how have you reaped the benefits, or how has time proven that to be a good decision?
Well, we've already actually had some involvement from the community. So what we got out of it was actually free development.
Absolutely.
We have for our Libretto open source project, we have, was it 2?
Yeah, we had 2 full cloud providers that were added by the community that we didn't have to develop in-house that we can leverage for our organization. In addition, we learn who's in the space. People get visibility of us as a company. They see the technologies that we're doing. And it ends up being, some level of marketing to a very specific technical demographic that helps us with our hiring, helps us for our recruitment as well. Maybe someone's not looking for a job, but we see them committing heavily to our repos. We're going to reach out to them and say, hey, we really like the work you did. Would you be interested in coming and working with us on this in an official capacity? There's a lot of really nice ways to be able to leverage that work. And you feel good because you've given someone powerful tools, and it has other smaller side effects. There's other people like me that are learning from open source. I want them to be able to learn from the open source that we release. And that's the next generation of developers, and they're going to remember us as an organization.
This has been a fascinating conversation, you guys, and we didn't even get to the end customers, who I would love to talk about another time with you guys, and how they get involved and how they participate. And there's kind of this whole kind of new kind of, processes and practices of open source ecosystems that I think that people are just starting to really learn, really the masses out there, developers who, are still waiting to participate in these communities. And, I think one of the core things I get out of this call is how the developer ecosystem has evolved, and how we're seeing, almost, the evolution of, a lot of the companies that we see come into this space are kind of building tools that are designed in many respects for open source communities, right? And so those automation tools that you talk about, the messaging tools that that you guys are developing, such as Nats. I mean, these are all kind of a real kind of a reflection on open source communities and the tools that have been implemented to try to make them more efficient, to make them more automated, to make
open source software is the building blocks of the internet that we know today.
Yeah.
Companies like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, that are dealing with the biggest scale we've ever seen on the internet are leveraging open source tools, whether that's MySQL or other database technologies. Most of the stuff in the data store space has gone open source. You look at Redis, Memcache, Mongo, Riak, Ceph. All of these are open source tools being leveraged by the biggest companies in the world. It really has changed the way that we do business.
Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to talk with us. Lee, thank you for joining me as the co-host for this call. And Josh, always great to chat. And Jaime, I really enjoyed your perspectives here. And you guys, we're going to have to start polling 2-year-olds and see what they're doing these days.
Yeah. Sure. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Alex.
Yeah.
All right.
Nice to meet you, Lee.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Apcera is the sponsor for this episode of the new Stack Analysts. Apcera is one of these companies that is really focusing on providing the trust and security that companies really need when they're thinking about delivering their workloads in today's dynamic cloud environment. We're living in a world of distributed infrastructure with a real need for a policy-first approach, something that Apcera really focuses on. Apcera delivers that increase in agility, that security, and that speed across any IT infrastructure that companies really need. You can learn more about Apcera at apcera.com. That's APCERA.com. Thanks again, and I hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.